We'll have an hour and a half. There's toilets out to the left, there's bars at the back. Really turn your phones off and save the questions till the second half. And if you do feel a little weep coming on, just stifle it. I love Bob Dylan. Oh, fuck you, Bob. What do you mean he's a woman? So, it can be painful. So we're going to have a good night tonight, I know, because as I said, Mark's a brilliant speaker. So we're going to give him a round of applause, turn our phones off and settle in for a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Evening, everyone. Thanks for turning out. I did a talk in Birmingham once, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, I know Jimmy Page. I'll ask him along to your next talk." And I was like, "I'd rather you didn't. Probably better that he's not there." This is the first airing for this presentation, so anything can happen. I've got no idea how long it's going to take. I should be done by about 3 AM, I think, with the number of slides I've got. I'm going to attempt to do the first half in a little over an hour, which is about occult aspects of the Beatles, and then in part 2, we're going into McCartney territory, which is sometimes known as Paul is Dead, but I prefer to refer to it as the McCartney replacement. Now, the thing about me as a researcher is I don't discriminate. I'm very inclusive, I'm very liberal and progressive in keeping with the times, right? So I denigrate everyone's heroes, and I make an effort to try and piss everyone off. So I'm talking about the Beatles tonight, but if they're not your favourite group, don't worry, because I will get around to yours at some point. I'll cover them all. But joking aside, it actually gives me no pleasure to be highlighting the dark and nefarious and unsettling aspects of the Beatles. I wish I could be up here telling you that the story of the Beatles is exactly as it's been presented to us in the mainstream all these decades, which is they're just 4 regular working class lads from Liverpool who formed a band, worked really hard, wrote some great songs, crossed their fingers for good luck, did a bit of hustling, and against all the odds became the most successful and influential band of all time, known all around the world, and with their influence still being felt today, 50 odd years on. Unfortunately, when you do the research, you come to discover that that's not the case. And I'm going to be presenting lots of this evidence this evening to reinforce that viewpoint. So it's not a popular job doing this, but when you discover that these elements are there, I feel that a responsibility comes to communicate them to other people, to at least give them the opportunity to take these aspects on board. So that's why I do this. I am a Beatles fan. I love their music. I find them an absolutely fascinating group to study. And in all honesty, I think a researcher could devote a full-time career of several decades to getting into all the intricacies of this band and all the affiliations and all the great cultural contributions in 50 years. Probably not. Okay, so let's get into it. And a good place to start would be with the naming of the group itself. The Beatles, where did that come from? So it's generally assumed that the spelling of the group name with the A is a reference to the word beat, and they've cleverly incorporated it into the word Beatle. The group in their early interviews said that they were very influenced by Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and so they selected the name the Beatles because it's another insect group which is kind of an homage to the Crickets. So the group had many different names before it finally settled on the Beatles. In my first book I mentioned that the group was called the Blackjacks, it morphed into the Quarrymen, and then there were further names such as Johnny and the Moondogs, the Nurk Twins for just 2 days, the Beatles spelt in that strange way with 2 A's, the Silver Beatles, the Silver Beats, and the Silver Beatles, before eventually surviving as the Beatles. And there was an interview which John Lennon gave in 1961 for Motorbeat magazine, where he said rather cryptically, when he was asked what the name is all about, it came in a vision, he said. A man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day on you are Beatles with an A. Thank you, Mr. Man, they said, thanking him. There seems to be an element of occult, masterful speaking going on there. There was a book put out by Aleister Crowley, the notorious occultist, whose name always crops up in this style of research. When you get into the true nature of the corporate music industry, you will find that Crowley crops up like the proverbial bad penny at some point or other. So he put out a book called The Winged Beetle. Rather interestingly, you've got the name in that title of two of Paul McCartney's bands. So after the Beatles, he formed the Wings, and there it is, the Winged Beetle, very much drawing on Egyptian mythology, and in particular the scarab beetle of Egyptian mythology. This was a creature that was revered by that civilization, and there was one particular breed of it, a dung beetle, which we see here, rolling a ball of dung across the ground. And to the Egyptians that worshipped this creature, it represented the sun being rolled across the sky in their solar worship system. So the scarab beetle was very central to Egyptian mythology. Here it is in a hieroglyph. And it would appear that the Beatles were very heavily influenced by Egyptian mythology, as we'll see as we go on. So already we're getting into occult, mystery school, esoteric type traditions and teachings here. On that note, this is a crest, a coat of arms, which was devised for George Martin, the long-time Beatles producer. And this was done in fairly recent times. I think it's not an ancestral thing, it's something that was created for him a few decades ago, after he had become famous. And you'll note that in the centre of the crest there, you've got 3 of these scarab beetles. Not 4, but 3. So that becomes interesting as we move on as well. Going back to the upbringing, the childhood of the young John Lennon. So he grew up in an area of Walton, Liverpool, when he was housed with his aunt. In that area, you had Strawberry Field Children's Home, this very gothic-looking establishment, which is quite unsettling, looks more like a cemetery. This obviously influenced the song Strawberry Fields Forever, and this was in the vicinity of the area that the young Lennon grew up. This is the tribute to John Lennon, which is in Central Park in New York, very close to where he was gunned down in December 1980. And it's the Strawberry Fields Monument in Central Park with the title of his famous song, Imagine, in the middle. There's all kinds of esoteric and occult overtones to the design in that as well. But that was very much influenced by the earlier Strawberry Field in Liverpool. This is a map of the area where Lennon grew up. So you've got Menlove Avenue running through the centre there. If you look at some of the road names, you find that there's a Druidsville Road. There's also a Quarry Street. You've got the Colestones Park over there on the left, and there's also a road called the Hollies. And the holly tree is something that was very important to ancient Druidic traditions in the UK. You also have a number of road names that relate to Druids, such as Druids Cross Road and Druidsville Road. So reportedly, this was an area which was absolutely rich with ceremonial witchcraft, sorcery kind of activity in ancient times, before it was modernised. And there's a great video you can get on YouTube, which is called Strawberry Field Stargate, the mystic childhood of John Lennon, which goes into all of this. This particular still has a giant yew tree in the centre of this roundabout. It's interesting that Operation Yew Tree is the name that was chosen for the so-called investigation / whitewash into establishment pedophilia in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal. So you've got some overtones there relating back to occultism and these druidic kind of practices. So this is from that video. It's a caption where the video compiler has said that all of these surroundings must have directly impacted upon the young Lennon as he played in the ancient strawberry fields which had remained intact for centuries. The field retained the same mystical animism within its environment from pre-Christian times. And he goes on, these childhood experiences would have been released from his subconscious as Lennon began to explore Hinduism and other spiritual paths during the writing and recording of Strawberry Fields Forever, which is certainly an interesting song by anyone's standards, which you can study for days at the very beginning of the Beatles' psychedelic experimental period, phase 2. So this is John Lennon's old man, Freddie Lennon. Interesting design for this single which he put out. He was a sort of amateur part-time musician himself. This one was called That's My Life. It's misspelt here as live. But look at the pattern that's been chosen for the record sleeve. You've got this black and white checkerboard duality, which is very prominent within Freemasonry and other occult mystery schools, representing the duality that's inherent in creation. So why would that be chosen for this particular record sleeve would be a good question to ask. So Freddie Lennon was a sailor, and he spent a lot of the young John's childhood away at sea. But he made this record, and I've got a little snippet of it here, if the audio is going to work. I'm just playing it for you out of interest, because to me, he sounds uncannily like John. It's actually like listening to John speaking the part on this record. It's incredible how alike these two sound. Let's see if this is going to work.
I think of my story that I once left up. I sailed with the tides and lived on dreams. I watched the sunrise over every ocean. That's my life, that's my love, and my home. It started in Liverpool, where I was born. No father to advise me, but I carried on. First time I saw the sea, I just knew this had to be. That's my life, that's my love, and my home.
That's some catchy shit, man. I'm going to be humming that on the way home. So that was Freddie Lennon. There is a character in the Beatles animated movie, which doesn't actually feature the Beatles, but it puts their name on it, Yellow Submarine, by the name of Old Fred. And he's a sailor, so you've got to wonder whether that character was based on old Freddie Lennon here. But we know very little about him other than that. He was absent for a lot of the time, as I say. This is a picture of the first complete lineup of the Beatles back in the early pre-fame days. So you've got John, Paul, George. On drums is Pete Best, who was in place before he got kicked out in favour of Ringo, allegedly because Pete Best was too good looking and he was getting all the girls, and the other members weren't too happy about it, so they solved that one by putting Ringo in place, right? No further problems. And then over on the right-hand side, you've got Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the original bassist for the group before Paul McCartney took over. So this is a picture of Stu Sutcliffe, who came from Scotland. And we have to wonder, with this particular picture, whether there are elements of Freemasonry at play here. Many researchers suggest or suspect that all of the members of the Beatles come from Masonic families. It's very difficult to validate this because there's little to nothing on the public record to confirm whether any of the family members that the Beatles were connected to were part of Masonic fraternities. But we got quite a telltale sign being done by Stuart Sutcliffe with his hands here, making the pyramid symbol, which is a sign that Masons make to communicate their membership to each other. And of course, his family came out of Scotland, home of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, 33 degrees. Here's another picture of Stuart Sutcliffe, which won't be by accident. He's behind this gate, and you'll see that it's designed to render 3 6s, the number 666, which we see time and time again in the story of the corporate music industry and its true nature and what it's really used for. You wouldn't believe the number of times that 666 crops up. And as I say, this will be a specifically posed picture rather than something that just happened by accident. So the story with Stuart Sutcliffe is that he passed away at the ripe old age of 21 in 1962. And the official account of what happened was, it was during the days that the Beatles were playing their early gigs in Hamburg, and they were making a name for themselves. They were grinding hard and really getting themselves established as a group, playing these all-night gigs in Hamburg, this really punishing schedule. And one night, so the story goes, they got into a fight with a group of locals in one of the gig venues, And this massive brawl broke out, and Stuart Sutcliffe is said to have been kicked in the head. Not too long afterwards, he was said to have developed a brain aneurysm, and he eventually died from that, so the story goes, at 21. The story is slightly complicated by the fact that Stuart's sister, Pauline Sutcliffe, put out a book in later years where she suggested that her brother, Stuart, had been involved in a homosexual affair with John Lennon. And she points to a particular fight that those two had, suggesting that this may have been what was responsible for Stuart developing this brain hemorrhage. So either way, we've got our first highly suspicious death within the Beatles' close circle, and it's very far from the last. So Stuart Sutcliffe moves out, and Paul McCartney is put onto bass to replace him. Then, as I say, Pete Best is removed in favour of Ringo. Pete Best's mother, Mona Best, owned a venue in Liverpool called the Casbah Coffee Club, and this was where the Beatles played some of their early gigs alongside the Cavern Club. An interesting story about that is there's a long-time associate of the Beatles by the name of Neil Aspinall. And alongside Mel Evans, who was the other kind of Beatles roadie and general companion, these two guys travelled with them at their gigs all over the place and were very much a part of the Beatles inner circle. Neil Aspinall was a very trusted, close confidant of the Beatles. But it turns out that during a time that he was lodging in Pete Best's house, he just happened to impregnate his mother, Mona Best, the owner of the Casbah Coffee Club, and the result was a son who was named Rogue Best in a very bizarre state of affairs. So very shortly after this, we find that Pete has been removed from the group, possibly out of some kind of embarrassment that ensued out of this whole scenario. But either way, we're then left with the lineup of the Beatles that we all know: John, Paul, George and Ringo, and so it goes forward from there. There's been a constant suggestion over the years that the Beatles were a creation of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is very closely linked to British military intelligence, MI6, and in turn it has connections going into the Stanford Research Institute in the United States and the Rockefeller Foundation. It's all about social engineering. It's all about the shaping and moulding of societal attitudes and doing big mind control psyop numbers on the general public under the radar and achieved through culture so that nobody suspects that it's happening. Their guard is down. There's very little by way of documentary evidence to confirm that the Beatles came out of the Tavistock Institute. There are many clues and pointers, and it's very reasonable, in my view, to speculate that that's what we're looking at here. But in terms of finding documentary proof and citations, this becomes very difficult. The idea that the Beatles were a creation of the Tavistock Institute, or at the very least, that they formed and got started organically and naturally, and at the point where they started to become really successful and influential, then in stepped the social engineers to steer them off down their desired path. That seems to have come primarily from the author of this book, Dr. John Coleman. So he put out this book in 1991, titled Conspirators' Hierarchy, the Story of the Committee of 300. So he's talking about how the controllers of society, the real controllers, not governments, but those that pull the strings of governments, how they organise themselves. And he's talking about how all of this filters down the pyramid of power into these different aspects of human society, the entertainment industry being just one of them. So he claims in this book that the Beatles were absolutely a product of these social engineering think tanks, and that their role in the 1960s was very much in line with the culture creation, the counterculture that was happening in those times. Their role was to change societal attitudes, and it was in line with everything else that was happening at that time, such as the influx of LSD and other psychedelics, which were being put into the market by the CIA and other such agencies, and movements which were emerging, such as feminism and free love and the whole hippie flower power ideals. His claim is that this was all put into society to subvert traditional values and change cultural systems, and the Beatles were a very key part in that. Unfortunately, Coleman doesn't provide any citations for this, so he makes these fairly wild claims, but he doesn't offer any documentary evidence to back it up. So we're left to speculate on whether there's any validity to what he's saying or not. His main claim is that there was this guy who came out of the Frankfurt School in Germany, which is very closely linked to the Tavistock Institute. Again, it was all about sowing cultural trends and mindsets in the general public. A guy by the name of Theodor Adorno. And in the book, Coleman states that this guy was known as the Karl Marx of music. He called his sound corrosive and unacceptable, and it was based on a 12 atonal system consisting of heavy, repetitive sounds. So Coleman clearly was not a fan of popular music. He was very scoffing and derisive of it. And he claims that Adorno specifically created these sounds to subvert morals and to have that kind of effect on society. So he goes on, Adorno believed the bourgeoisie wanted music that didn't bother them or make them think. Tavistock wanted to pass on these new musical experiences to new audiences affecting the masses, so uncomfortable music was born. So that's where the idea of Theodor Adorno having written many of the lyrics to key Beatles songs comes from, out of the Frankfurt School. Again, as I say, there's nothing to directly corroborate this. There's no citation available to it. It remains within the realms of opinion. I personally think it's rather unlikely that a dusty old academic professor in Germany could have written many of the complex lyrics to these supposedly Lennon and McCartney penned songs. But having said that, when you look at the complexity of the lyrics in those early songs, and you consider just how young these guys were, when the Beatles first broke through with Love Me Do towards the end of 1962, George, for instance, was still only 19 years of age. And Lennon and McCartney were writing songs about the life experience and human relations and emotions and things like this at the age of 20 and 21. So I do question whether a couple of green, young, budding songwriters like them could have been responsible for some of these incredibly far-reaching lyrics. So if we dismiss Adorno from the picture, it doesn't necessarily preclude other parties from maybe having had a hand in these songs. So this is from a blog site titled No One Has to Die Tomorrow, and it's quite telling. The writer states, the Beatles' ascension to the top rung of the rock and roll pantheon, displacing Elvis Presley, was rigged and engineered into place by the British Crown and British military intelligence. Again, that's another bold statement to make, but when we look at the way things played out, it's not too much of a stretch to assume that may be indeed what happened. So, for instance, in August '63, at their first major TV appearance at the London Palladium, the newspaper reported that the police had to hold back 1,000 squealing teenagers, but the story was fabricated. The newspaper photo actually tightly cropped 3 screaming teenagers and claimed it was 1,000. Then, when we look at Beatlemania hysteria, manufactured at JFK Airport in February of '64, when the Beatles arrived in the USA to perform for the Ed Sullivan Show, busloads of girls from a Bronx school were paid by Beatles promoters to scream hysterically when the Beatles got off the plane and went into the terminal. So that's a story that can be backed up, and that actually took place. So very early on, there were efforts to establish the Beatles as this cultural phenomenon, and it was very important to those that were controlling them that they got into that kind of influential position. So that certainly suggests some help from other parties in those very early days. When we look at some early Beatles record sleeves and going through the years, we get some very interesting symbolism. This ties in with things that I've talked about in other presentations. The controllers of these industries do like to place in plain sight little symbolic reminders and representations of what they're really all about. The occult secret societies and mystery school fraternities that they represent, and the kind of ritualistic belief systems that they adhere to. Because at the end of the day, the controllers of the music industry, as with every other aspect of organised society, are dark occultists. and they have their religious belief systems which are very important to them, and they stick to them every step of the way. It doesn't matter who believes that, who scoffs at it, who rejects it, who thinks it can't possibly be true. It doesn't make a difference to the fact that it's very important to these people. If it wasn't, we wouldn't keep seeing the same symbolic renderings being trotted out decade after decade after decade. And when we go back to look at the early days of the Beatles, we see exactly the same signs and symbols and motifs and emblems that we see with the likes of Katy Perry and Kanye West and Rihanna and Britney Spears and all these artists that we have today. So with the Beatles, one of their early albums from 1963, we can see the four lads appearing with half of their face in shadow, leaving one eye on each face visible with the other one in the shadows. So we've got ideas of duality again here, light and dark, good and evil, this duality that's present in creation, polarities. This album, The Beatles 65, has them all sat around underneath umbrellas. Umbrellas become very interesting when you start studying symbology in popular culture as well. Just a few years ago we had the Rihanna song, Umbrella, which was a massive #1 single. I mentioned that in my book. There's a researcher by the name of Lennon who did a great breakdown of everything that song and video represents. And on the surface, it appears to be Rihanna saying to her lover, "You can come under my umbrella, the protection of it, and I'll protect you from harm that is out there." But Lennon points out that when you get down to the fine detail of the song and the video, what it's actually referring to is an individual being under the influence or the possession of an entity, a non-human entity. And in the case of that particular song, it's this entity that goes by the name of Rain Man. As I say, there's a very detailed breakdown of that. But interestingly, several decades before that, we had the Beatles sitting underneath umbrellas. Now the word umbrella is derived from the Latin umbra, and when you get into the definition of it, from this online definition here, late 16th century denoting a phantom or ghost from the Latin, meaning literally shade. So suddenly that picture becomes slightly less innocent, possibly, and we're getting into some supernatural realms. And again, you could make a case for any one of these images in isolation being just one of those things, the photographer trying to be creative, the group trying to do something different, etc. You could write one or two of these off in that way. But when it keeps happening, and when you see these same ideas being communicated in popular culture decade after decade with all kinds of different groups, then patterns and trends start to emerge. So unless you're in a very heavy state of denial, or you have some kind of ulterior motive and some kind of job or salary or pension scheme to protect, then you have to start to acknowledge that there's something going on here. This was from the Beatles' Help soundtrack album of 1965, and on the surface of it, what we appear to have is the four guys spelling out the word help, H-E-L-P, in semaphore, right? That's what you would expect that to be all about. Well, it's not the case. The signs that they're throwing up here do not spell H-E-L-P. They spell complete gibberish when you assign letter values to them. What we actually have is the Beatles emulating grade signs which came out of the AA organisation, nothing to do with cars or alcoholics. This was Argentum Astrum, which was one of the occult mystery schools, which was helmed by Aleister Crowley for a period. Aleister Crowley established this system. And within it, you had these grade signs where the adepts, the initiates, would spell out certain ideas in what appears to be semaphore, but is a variation on it. So you can see that you've got the Beatles here replicating these grade signs coming out of AA. So we've got a direct link there to Crowley. Why would these be on a record sleeve, and who, in 1965, had the remotest idea that that's what they were looking at? This is a rare Dutch version of the Beatles' Help album, where you've got the same grade signs going on, but in the background you've got what appears to be the corporate logo of the Shell Oil Corporation. But in fact, what it's representing is the rising sun. that is what that logo has always been all about, rather than a shell. It's a very sly way of getting an image of the rising sun into the public consciousness. So we're into the realms of solar worship here, possibly going back to those earlier ancient Egyptian traditions. The Beatles were always pitted as the rivals to the Rolling Stones. That's the way the press ran in the 1960s. The idea was that when the Beatles first came out, they were this kind of clean-cut, nice group that everyone in the family could like. They were these nice, lovable lads with pleasant pop songs. And the Rolling Stones, who emerged the following year, were all these kind of brutish ruffians, you know, bit dangerous, bit edgy, and they were for people for whom the Beatles were a bit too clean-cut. So the idea was that young people were either into the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. And this is a dialectic that's been played out over the decades, time and time again. You know, I'm old enough to remember the early 80s, when girls at my school were either into Duran Duran or Spandau Ballet, right? It was one or the other. And then in the 90s, you had Blur being pitted against Oasis as part of that whole Britpop thing, and people were picking sides, you know, which one were you into? So they've trotted this one out so many times through the ages. But in the 60s, it was the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. But there was so much overlap and crossover between these two groups. And you're left, again, with the very strong suggestion that both these groups were created and controlled and having their strings pulled by the same sources. So there was a guy called Andrew Loog Oldham, who was, for a time, affiliated to the Beatles. And then he jumped ship and went over to the Rolling Stones and worked as a publicist for them. Or it may have been the other way round. My friend Matt here can probably tell me, because we've got a fellow researcher here, Matt Sergiu, who is the proprietor of the Occult Beatles blog site, very knowledgeable guy. He's here to let me know if I slip up every now and again. So, can you remember if Lou Oldham worked with the Beatles and then the Stones, or the other way around?
Yeah, Lou Oldham worked for Brian Epstein as a publicist. I think that was one of the first jobs he had in the music industry, and then, as you say, he jumped ship and became the Rolling Stones manager.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got the same individual working with both groups here. And then you've got the fact that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones hung out together. They were friends. They used to party together. There's this famous story of a car crash which took place in January of '67 involving Paul McCartney's Mini. We're going to get into all this in part 2. But the circumstances in which that took place were the Beatles were partying with the Rolling Stones, and they said, hey, let's all go down to Keith Richards' place, Redlands in Surrey, and carry on the party there. So the Beatles and the Rolling Stones went off together. So they were very far from rivals. And with this particular album release from the Rolling Stones, which came out in December 1967, and was interestingly titled Their Satanic Majesty's Request, go figure, you have what is effectively a pastiche of the cover design of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album from the Beatles 6 months later. And hidden in the designs here, cleverly, you can see that there's renderings of each of the 4 Beatles, Paul, George, John, Ringo, cunningly concealed in the way that many of the clues in Sgt. Pepper were. So many researchers believe that the Beatles and the Stones were both being controlled by Tavistock, and the purpose of these two groups was to play their part in the way the counterculture panned out in the 1960s, and to be the British variant on what was happening over in the United States. An affiliation with Jimmy Savile, there he is. You can't really do one of these talks without him cropping up at some point or another. So Jimmy Savile went out on a few live gig dates with the Beatles, and he introduced their show, and he evidently used to travel in the van with them, so God only knows what that experience was like. And here's a picture of Savile in quite an interesting designed jacket, because it's the same as that Freddie Lennon sleeve from earlier, right? You've got the black and white Masonic checkerboard duality idea being conveyed here. And when it comes to this particular design, particularly when you see it in garments like this, it's been identified as a mind control trigger. So when we get into MK Ultra style mind control programming, such as Monarch and these other variations of it, you find that this design, the black and white duality, is used as a trigger for programmed victims. I'm not sure who the other guy is. There's a 5th guy there. Is that Tony Prince from Radio Luxembourg? I think it might be. And here's another picture of the Beatles with Savile, and they all appear to be in a trance. put into a trance. Interesting picture here of the four boys in boaters and these suits, and you've got John and Paul putting their hand inside their jacket, which is a very telling pose. And again, it comes out of Freemasonry. We've seen many world leaders and dignitaries and aristocrats striking this particular pose over the years. Here's another picture of John and Paul doing it. So what's that all about? Is that another indication of secret society fraternities to which these guys belonged?
He's doing it in the statue in Liverpool. Sorry to interrupt, but it's before the round up your scene.
I've seen that. Yeah. Another picture here where Paul, or isn't, is striking the same pose. Now, where you find the presence of occult symbology and mystery schools and secret society fraternities such as Freemasonry, it's often the case that links to military intelligence aren't far from the surface. As I mentioned, the Tavistock Institute is an expression of British military intelligence, very closely tied to MI6, as is the BBC, which is basically a state propaganda arm of the British establishment, no matter how much they might try and insist that they're independent and balanced and all this. So this is the long-time Beatles producer, George Martin, who was very instrumental in the way that group's sound panned out. One of his early jobs, when he wasn't serving in the Royal Navy, that is, because there's connections going back to military roles with all these people. Andrew Lew Goldham's father was a Royal Air Force guy. You find these connections going on for days. One of George Martin's early jobs was at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And this was an institution that specialised in experimentation with sound frequencies, what could be achieved by manipulating sound, the effects that it would have on the human psyche and on human perceptions and things like that. So the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was responsible for, among many other things, the original theme tune for Doctor Who, which is obviously very eerie and very experimental for its time. That was a very emblematic sound of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. George Martin put out a record in 1962, just prior to his getting involved with the Beatles, under the pseudonym of Ray Cathode. And I've got a little snippet of it here, and I want to play it to you because, to my mind, it sounds very similar to elements of the Beatles' sound that would come a few years later. And I think at this point in 1962, you can already hear part of the Beatles' signature sound being honed by this guy before they'd even become famous. See what you think. I can certainly hear elements of Beatles tunes in what was going on then. I was talking with Matt the other day, forgive me for calling on you again, but there was this story of how George Martin got involved with the Beatles, and you were suggesting that he may have been blackmailed into it by Brian Epstein, according to the story.
Yeah, that's according to Mark Lewison, the much-hailed Beatles historian who's written the book, Volume 1 of 3 that are to come, which is called Tune In. I don't know if anyone's heard of Mark Lewison. He's like hailed as I say, as this great Beatles historian. He's been looking into the Beatles' career for 35, 40 odd years now. And in 2013 he released the first volume of 3 Beatles biographies. It's over 1,000 pages long. And that was in 2013, and volume 2 still hasn't come out because he's putting so much work into this, so we're told. Anyway, one of the things that he discovered in his research was, we hear this story that what happened was when the Beatles got their contract, they met with George Martin. He wasn't initially impressed with them, but he was spellbound by their charm, and he decided, what a bunch of charming lads, I think I'll sign them even though they've got no talent, or I don't feel that they have any talent. Well, it's since turned out, according to Mark Lewison's research, was he was pretty much arm twisted into taking the Beatles on, because it turned out that George Martin, who was married at the time, was having an affair with his secretary, and this was back in the early 60s. I wasn't around then, believe it or not, but apparently this was quite, you know, this was back in the days when such a thing would have been seen as, you know, it could have destroyed a career, you know. So he was basically arm twisted into taking the Beatles on. He didn't want to sign them, but EMI insisted that EMI and Brian Epstein effectively blackmailed George Martin into signing them, and if he didn't sign them, then his affair would have been exposed. And George Martin, who was friends with Mark Lewison, has never spoke to him again after that, because he exposed this in his book. But that's according to letters that he found and documentation. This is what happened. He was effectively blackmailed.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Lewison in his book just forgets to mention that McCartney was replaced. Dumb. Just left it out, you know. But anyway, so George Martin, been doing too many of these. George Martin was knighted by the Queen, of course, and he was known as the fifth Beatle. He was very much a part of the furniture with that group. It certainly looks as if it was always on the cards that he would be involved with them. And he was very instrumental in their whole sound, particularly in their latter period, as they entered the Sgt. Pepper psychedelic era, of course. This is an excerpt from my book, Musical Truth, Volume 1, where I state, the dark manipulations of the music business are as old as the industry itself, and early examples of the dubious calling cards evident in the contemporary scene are equally present in its formative years. Mind control, military intelligence, pedophilia, and occult fascination are, it seems, nothing new. As I mentioned, those elements go hand in hand as very strange bedfellows. Where you find one, you don't have to look too far to find the others. And this has cropped up time and time again in Britain and America, in all kinds of genres, in all decades. Then I go on to say, the writer, I'm citing some other writer in this piece, speculates on there being an organised link between the British music scene of the mid to late 1960s and that which emerged out of LA's Laurel Canyon district in the same time frame, all connected by the British and US government, military and intelligence services, because military intelligence is an oxymoron, you know. So we're into the realms of Dave McGowan and all his exceptional research with his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which he put out in 2014, where he highlighted the unbelievable amount of family links between all the prominent musicians and the movers and shakers of the counterculture scene in California in the mid to late 1960s and the military intelligence communities and expressions of the military and the government. And it becomes interesting when you apply that style of scrutiny to the British side of things, because you find exactly the same types of links cropping up with all the movers and shakers on the British side of the pond. The suggestion of many researchers is that, like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones were a creation of some arm of the British government intelligence services, possibly the Tavistock Institute, as I mentioned before, and that, like their northern counterparts, they also constituted a massive exercise in shaping the societal attitudes of a generation. Mind-altering drugs were never far from the picture, so I'm just recapping there on something that I said before. But when it comes to that whole Laurel Canyon scene coming out of LA in those times, there's a little bit of loose connection to the Beatles' story. Nothing direct, nothing too telling, but a few little ancillary things going on. So this guy sat at the typewriter is the Beatles' publicist in their early years, and then he left for a period and came back to them in their latter years, a man by the name of Derek Taylor, one of the early PR guys for the Beatles. During the period that he left the group, he went over to LA and based himself in the Laurel Canyon area, right in the belly of the beast. And he started doing publicity for some of the key names coming out of that scene, such as John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas and the Beach Boys, and Buffalo Springfield and these kind of groups. Derek Taylor was instrumental in promoting the Monterey Pop Festival, which happened in June 1967. Very instrumental in springboarding the whole Summer of Love of that year on the California side of things. And one of the curators of that event, alongside John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, is said to have been Paul McCartney, who was very heavily involved in booking the acts and shaping and moulding that whole pop festival. Interestingly, the Beatles did not play at it. You had the UK represented by The Who, but the Beatles had stopped performing by 1967. They played their final gig together, with the exception of the Abbey Road Studios rooftop jam in 1969, in August of 1966. No more live dates after that point. This ties in very much with what I'll be discussing in part 2, which is the suspicion that Paul McCartney was either killed or replaced at that time in 1966, and that's why the Beatles never played live again after that date, because the differences between the previous McCartney and the one that was brought in would be too obvious for the fans to see. But either way, in 1967, you've got McCartney working with Derek Taylor and John Phillips curating the Monterey Pop Festival. And that event was absolutely laden with LSD, contributed by those nice folks at the CIA, and it was all part of a massive scheme to get the kids of that generation completely hooked on sex and drugs and rock and roll. You know, this new psychedelic rock music, these mind-altering drugs, and these new attitudes towards sexuality and morals. Very changing in society, and of course that was the plan all along, with the full involvement of military intelligence. So Derek Taylor based himself in LA for this period, in the Laurel Canyon district, reportedly. There's a song on the Beatles' Magical Mystery Tour album, released at the end of 1967, penned by George Harrison, and it's called Blue Jay Way. It's one of the most out there psychedelic Beatles songs. And this song is said to have been inspired by an address that George was staying at in the Laurel Canyon area, named Blue Jay Way. And apparently George had arrived at this address and he was due to be joined by Derek Taylor and the other Beatles in due course, but for some reason they got lost or delayed and they were taking ages to get there. And so George is sat there kicking his heels and he decided to pen this song, talking about, you know, hurry up and get here, Blue Jay Way. So there's another loose Laurel Canyon link there. Another one, when I think of it, would be the fact that George actually died in Los Angeles. So he was attacked, famously, at his house at Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames at the end of 1999, when an intruder broke in, bypassed one of the most complex state-of-the-art security systems in the country at that time, reportedly, which George had installed, somehow got in and got involved in a fight with George Harrison on his stairs and stabbed him several times. And the story goes that George's wife, Olivia, beat the attacker over the head and fought him off and basically saved George's life, although he was in a pretty terrible state, you know, rushed to hospital, and he only lived less than another 2 years. He contracted cancer and all kinds of complications from these stab wounds he'd endured. But he actually died in Los Angeles. And when you look it up on Wikipedia, it states that he passed away at a friend's residence. And research into this has confirmed that the house in which George died was actually owned by Paul McCartney. And this again was very close to Laurel Canyon in LA, so we've got another connection to that very important location. This is John Lennon in his famous Lost Weekend period, which occurred around 1973-74. This is when Yoko Ono famously sent him away to be with their secretary by the name of May Pang, which is who he's seen kissing here. It's a very bizarre story. Apparently John and Yoko's marriage was failing, and so Yoko's suggestion to save it was that John went off on what's become this Lost Weekend period, where he holed himself up in LA and went out drinking with the likes of Harry Nilsson, who you can see getting pissed in the front ear, and all his other mates from the music scene in those times. And the idea was that he would just spend a bit of time away from Yoko and find himself and just do what he wanted to do, and then he could come back to the marital home refreshed and they could start all over again. As I say, it's a very strange way of going about things in my book, but that all occurred in LA, and John was sort of hanging around. Sorry, man, I can't concentrate with the talking going on. So he was hanging around Sunset Boulevard and that whole area, you know, during this time. Now, we get back to Egyptian themes and symbolism when it comes to Paul McCartney's recently released album, Egypt Station, which came out last year. You can have a field day deciphering all the symbolism that's included in the sleeve. And it puts me in mind of an album that came out in the 1970s, a solo album by McCartney, which is titled Ram. And here he is interacting with this ram, surprisingly enough. And the ram is a creature which crops up again in Egyptian mythology, very central to that whole belief system. Not the only time that McCartney has used it either. He put out an album in 1977 under a pseudonym of Percy Thrillington, and it was an orchestral album, instrumentation. And on the cover of it, you've got this interesting depiction of a guy with a ram's head on. So there seems to be some very great interest in Egyptian symbolism from McCartney here. Now this one is going to surprise people. This comes from Matt's blog, once again, the Occult Beatles. This is another creature which crops up in Egyptian mythology, Heket. And according to this extract from the blog, it's symbolically connected to the Nile, as is Khnum, who's also been dubbed the King of Frogs. Where are we going with frogs? Well, it will become clear with the next slide. The 19th century poet and writer and researcher of ancient Egypt, Gerald Massey, states in his written work, Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World, the frog was a lunar type. The name of the frog in Egyptian is Ka, whence the lunar lady, and such, and so on. You know, it's explaining where the idea of this frog comes from in Egyptian mythology. Now, anyone remember a connection to frogs when it comes to the Beatles? How about the very bizarre record which Paul McCartney put out at the end of 1984, Paul McCartney and the Frog Chorus, the Rupert Bear song, right? I remember this very well because everyone, when this record came out, was like, what the fuck is this? What's he thinking of? Has he lost his mind? It was a very strange song for the guy that supposedly wrote the likes of Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby and Hey Jude and Let It Be to come out with a song singing about frogs. So on the surface, it appears to be this kind of cartoon, childish, sort of whimsical fantasy type thing that McCartney just wanted to get off his chest. But when you compare some of the imagery in this cartoon animated video to that song with this figure of Heket coming out of Egyptian mythology, you start to wonder whether this is another under-the-radar expression of these occult belief systems being put into their work. No end of high-level strangeness to get into, such as in this promotional picture for the group, where they all appear wearing Hannibal Lecter-style face masks for some reason or other. No idea why, but it's a little bit creepy in my book. So much for 4 lovable working-class lads from Liverpool that just got lucky, right? And made it against all the odds. It really does start to look as if all along they were being controlled and manipulated by other forces, with sort of 1 foot in military intelligence, social engineering circles, and 1 foot in dark occult belief system circles. Here's a picture of John Lennon with a flower over one eye. So again, we get the rendering of the one eye, the all-seeing eye, which crops up in Masonic symbolism and other kind of occult belief systems. Here's several pictures of McCartney, and he feels the need to cover that one particular eye in exactly the same way, decades apart. I really do wonder, when you get all these celebrities flashing up the hand signals, whether it's the Baphomet thing, or the 666, or the pyramid sign, or the covering of one eye, it happens so often, and it seems to happen so spontaneously and so regularly. It makes me wonder whether these people have been programmed to do this. Because you can study videos of where celebrities will suddenly become aware of a camera being on them, and they'll instinctively feel the need to flash up one of these symbols. It's as if there's been mind control programming in place to ensure that they do this without even being consciously aware of it. That's my personal feeling, having studied many such instances. Here's a still from the sleeve to the Yellow Submarine soundtrack album, where you've got a couple of classic signs, the 666, so-called one from McCartney, and one rendering of the horned hand sign from Lennon. There's two different versions of this picture. In one of them, Lennon has got the back of his hand to the camera, and in the other one he's got the palm of his hand to his camera. So he's giving both representations of that sign, the duality involved in it. When we're talking about occult influences on the Beatles, we can't dismiss Yoko, of course. Many Beatles fans will tell you that she was a witch. They're not saying that from a scholarly, studious kind of perspective, they're just telling you how they feel about her. But when you do the research, there is actually a lot to suggest that she was an occultist, a sorceress that was into, occult black magic. There was even a remix album of her material that came out a few years ago called Yes, I'm a Witch, as if to reinforce the point. And here she is in some transhumanist AI sunglasses, as if to complete the process. Many people feel that Yoko was sent into the Beatles camp to become John Lennon's mind control handler. This is a very plausible viewpoint as far as I'm concerned, because she did exert a very strong influence over him. She was quite a bit older than him, and she seemed to play on his emotional insecurities at having lost his mother at an early age. And John reportedly used to call Yoko Mother. That was one of his affectionate names for her. She certainly seemed to be able to pull his strings and get him to become involved in any kind of agenda or movement that he was instructed to, with reference to his political activism phase of the early 1970s, which would all appear to have been orchestrated at Yoko's whim. So she becomes interesting to study in herself. She came from an aristocratic bloodline family in Japan. On her mother's side, she was descended from the family of the one-time emperor of Japan. So she's not an average run-of-the-mill person. Her father was head of a very prominent and influential banking conglomerate in Japan and worked a lot in the United States. So a very interesting family background there. She was married once before, prior to meeting John, and she spent some time in a mental institution in Japan when that marriage broke down, reportedly. So I think that would be a rightful place for her, according to many Beatles fans. But one story which fascinates me when it comes to Yoko and how she came to be inserted into the Beatles' story concerns a particular town by the name of Scarsdale in Westchester County, New York State. This was a town where Yoko's family came over from Japan to settle in during the 1950s. So her parents moved over. A while later, Yoko came over to the United States and joined them in Scarsdale and spent some years living there. Scarsdale just happens to be the childhood home of Linda Eastman, who became Linda McCartney when she married Paul in 1969. So her family, which was originally named Epstein, before Leopold Epstein anglicised or Americanised his name to Lee Eastman, to sound more all-American and less Eastern European Jewish. So Linda Eastman grew up in Scarsdale and attended school and college there, and it just happened to be a town where another future Beatles wife, Yoko, would turn up at as well. What are the chances of that happening randomly? Of all the places in the world they could turn up. This raises the interesting question of what is it about Scarsdale, Westchester County, New York, that we need to know more about, and how is it that these two women both grew up there and then ended up marrying Beatles? This really does smack of mind control and, again, military intelligence-controlled social engineering narratives. Yoko's influence when it comes to occultism seems to have rubbed off on her son Sean, who she had, of course, with John, born in 1975, on John's own birthday, interestingly, 9th of October. So Sean makes music now and has done for many years. Here's a still from one of his videos where he's got a Masonic pyramid on his head and the all-seeing eye, the Eye of Horus. So he's rocking all the familiar occult symbols that we've seen time and time again, letting you know he's down with the program. And that seems to be the case with John's other son as well, Julian. Julian's mother was Cynthia, John's first wife prior to meeting Yoko, and of course Julian became a musician himself, and here he is himself rocking some familiar symbols. You've got the all-seeing eye thing going on there, and you've got the squaring of the circle idea being conveyed, another expression of Freemasonry, with the square sign that he's making over his eye. So when it comes to both of John Lennon's sons, we see them rocking all this Illuminati symbolism that kind of acts as a calling card to let you know who they really represent, who they're doing their bidding for, who's really pulling their strings. This raises the question of whether both of these sons were got to, in inverted commas, and bought off and coerced down a particular path, or whether it was always the case that John and Yoko were both involved within these circles all along. And all we're seeing with their offspring is just another generation expressing these same ideas through popular culture, which is the way it so often gets done. Here's an interesting handshake, which smacks of masonry, coming between John and Paul in very early days. Paul, in his Wings era, giving it a hand sign which is an expression of the square of the compass, that appears in Freemasonry. Linda doing the same thing. These are not throwaway hand signs. These are not natural ways to behave in front of a photographer. These are specifically posed for a reason, to convey an idea. And so we move on to one of the most analysed Beatles record sleeves of all time. You could write entire tomes on this. You could do a whole all-day presentation trying to get to the bottom of what the imagery on this sleeve represents. So this album came out in June 66. 666, right? Yesterday and Today. It's obviously a play on McCartney's song Yesterday, and it's a collection of Beatles' greatest hits, effectively, up to that point. It was put out in the US by Capitol Records, and they brought together a bunch of familiar Beatles songs up to that point in this compilation. Inexplicably, it was put out with this picture as the sleeve, where you've got 4 Beatles in butcher's smocks, surrounded by bits of raw meat, which have been dangled all over them, and decapitated and dismembered baby dolls, toy dolls. Very, very disturbing. So there's been lots of interpretations as to what this sleeve could mean. Probably the most innocent sounding one is that it was an expression on the part of the photographer and those that put the artwork forward. So the photographer was a guy by the name of Robert Whittaker, this Australian guy. He was very much into the avant-garde art scene of the 1960s. And he was into pushing the envelope when it came to conveying new ideas and being creative and being shocking. So he had the idea of having the Beatles covered in meat and these dismembered dolls. And the interpretation that's put on it is it was an expression of frustration at how Capitol Records had taken all these different Beatles songs from previous albums and put them all together in this new compilation in a haphazard, random kind of fashion that really made no sense and which differed majorly from the way the records were being put out in the UK. So in other words, Capitol were butchering the Beatles' back catalogue. And so the idea is that the Beatles, being seen as butchers with all this raw meat, was talking about that. That, as I say, is a fairly innocent interpretation of it. There were a number of pictures that were taken in this Robert Whittaker photo session, and they're all quite disturbing. There's one where George is hammering nails into John's head. There are several where the Beatles appear dissociated from reality, as if they're in a trance-like state, such as Paul is here, or one of the Pauls, right? So from this particular interpretation of it, it says, Paul looks skyward like an angel of death, an umbilical cord dangles limply from his wrist. And a quote which was attributed to Paul McCartney from the time of the photo shoot was, "It was very tasty meat," which is an interesting quote to come from one of the world's most famous vegetarians. This particular sleeve, according to this report from Birmingham Live, just up the road, and it was just the other day as well, on the 9th of May, states that this particular record sleeve, which was once owned by John Lennon, sold for £180,000. Now there was an uproar when this sleeve first came out, and it really wasn't out for very long because the Today and Today. This one becomes interesting as well because you'll note that Paul is inside a steamer trunk of the type that used to get loaded onto passenger ships to transport people's belongings long distance. So some people have interpreted that as Paul being inside a coffin, which reinforces the whole Paul is dead narrative, right? But there's another interesting interpretation put on it by somebody that wrote to me, and this person says, the Yesterday and Today album cover is a representation of the story of Osiris. We're back to Egyptian mythology again, mystery school teachings. And ancient Egyptian mythology is very closely tied into Freemasonry, by the way. His body parts were put into a casket, or a trunk, which washed up on the shore and was found by Isis, his wife. In other variations, she put the casket out to sea. The original butcher cover for the album represented Osiris having been chopped into 13 pieces by his brother Set, according to that myth. In any case, Paul sitting in the steamer trunk picture on Yesterday and Today represents Osiris. In the legend, Isis reassembled the body parts, brought the body back to life long enough to have sex with it, and subsequently bore Horus, who avenged his father's death by engaging Set in a battle. The two Pauls represent Osiris and Horus, the same guy in two bodies. A rubber soul occupying two bodies. In order for Beatles fans to connect the dots, there had to be clues about a death, because Osiris died and was reborn as Horus. Yesterday and Today, therefore, is a phrase used in ancient Egypt describing Osiris in the same way that some people say Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever in this era. That is an interesting interpretation to put on that sleeve. I'm sure you would agree, whether you go along with it or not. And the idea of death and rebirth, when it comes to Paul, who of all the Beatles is the one that just happens to be pictured in the casket, is very interesting when you frame it within the context of Paul is dead, legend, myth, which we'll be coming to in part 2. When we're discussing nefarious, dark, disturbing, unsettling aspects of the Beatles story then, we have to consider some of the suspicious circumstances in which some key players connected to the Beatles exited this world. So here are 6 that I've highlighted here. We've already discussed Stuart Sutcliffe, dead at the age of 21, before the Beatles achieved their fame. In the middle at the top there, we've got Brian Epstein, the Beatles' original manager, the guy that is credited with having put them on the map and really got their momentum going. And we heard earlier that he may have had a role in bringing George Martin into the frame as well as their producer. So Brian Epstein turned up dead at the age of 32, you know, like you do. In August of 1967, late August. So this was right at the end of the so-called Summer of Love. It was the summer of Sgt. Pepper, that incredibly influential album that appeared in June of that year. So all that social engineering and all the LSD and all the psychedelia of 1967, that summer, was coming to a close, and at the end of it we have Epstein checking out, reportedly as a result of an overdose. There's a very interesting video you can get online, which is the Beatles' reaction to the news of Brian Epstein's death. And in it, John is talking to the interviewer, and to my thinking, he seems genuinely shocked and disorientated. Like he didn't see this coming. He had no idea this was going to happen. And the interviewer says, you know, what are you going to do now that he's dead? And John says, oh, we don't know, you know, we've only just found out, we don't know. And he just seems completely mystified by the whole thing. It's very telling. You can just see it in the way he acts. The guy over on the right is Dr. Richard Asher. And he is the father of Jane Asher, who was the girlfriend of Paul McCartney for a large period in the 1960s, around about 63 to about 68. She was an actress herself. She had a brother by the name of Peter Asher, who was one half of the Peter and Gordon musical duo of the 60s. I've got some more about Asher in part 2, so I'll leave it until then. But at this point, I'll just say that Dr. Richard Asher was discovered dead in 1969 in some very suspicious circumstances, which I'll cover some more in part 2. Down on the bottom row, far left, we've got Mel Evans. I made a brief reference to him earlier. Alongside Neil Aspinall, he was one of the Beatles' trusted close confidants and roadies and general assistants. He followed the group around for pretty much their whole career. He died on the 4th of January 1976 at the hands of LA cops. You know, like you do. The story is that he got into some kind of altercation with his girlfriend, and he started behaving very erratically and unpredictably, and he started waving a rifle around. And so the cops were called, and apparently things got very out of hand, and Mel Evans just ended up being shot to death by the cops. This was at a point where he was just due to deliver, reportedly, the manuscript to a book talking about his years with the Beatles. And it was supposed to be a tell-all expose of the Beatles and what they were all about. That book never saw the light of day. The manuscript was due to be delivered to the publisher very shortly after Mel Evans was all shot up. So we're left wondering what may have been in that book. There are stories of certain extracts from it and certain pages having cropped up, but nobody really knows what the main content of that book was, and we probably never will. John Lennon, in the middle there, I'm sure we're all familiar with the story. He was reportedly, supposedly, shot and killed by a crazed fan, Mark David Chapman, on the 8th of December 1980. There's more to know about that whole story. Certainly, my research indicates that the real assassin was probably a guy by the name of Jose Perdomo, who was a CIA assassin involved in many black ops for that organisation over the years, notably in the Bay of Pigs, Fidel Castro events of the 1960s. And this guy was working as the doorman at the Dakota building on the night of Lennon being shot. And through what I've seen, the evidence that's available, it seems as if Chapman was used as the fall guy for that hit. And it was actually Perdomo that shot Lennon, but Chapman had been mind control programmed as a kind of Manchurian candidate to accept that he had done this. So he took the rap for it, and the whole thing is neatly tied up. Meantime, Jose Perdomo slinks back into the shadows, and very few people seem to think to question exactly what he was doing as the doorman on the Dakota building that night. Then finally we've got George Harrison, who died in late November 2001. And I mentioned earlier the circumstances in which that happened. He was attacked in 1999 by this guy Michael Abram, who seems also to have been mind-controlled to do the job, similar to Chapman. And presumably the intention was for Harrison to have died in 1999, to have been killed in that attack. But it didn't happen. As I mentioned, Olivia, his wife, fought the attacker off, and George survived for another 2 years, but not too long. Either way, we have to explain how the early incarnation of the Beatles, with their mop tops and their suits and their nice pleasant love songs, She Loves You, From Me to You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, became the group that we saw towards the end of the 1960s, doing songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Blue Jay Way and Revolution No. 9 and all this high-level strangeness, Tomorrow Never Knows, which was the start of that whole psychedelic period on the Revolver album. Something happened to this group. Are we to assume that this was a natural artistic progression? Or is it far more likely that it was always the plan for this group to be switched in this way and to start endorsing these other values that were coming in during those counterculture years of the 1960s, pushing LSD, pushing psychedelia, pushing occultism through their music and their sleeves and all of this? It's probably pretty obvious how I feel about it. Everyone else must decide for themselves, but for me, this is no natural artistic progression left to its own devices. This smacks of being handled every step of the way. Going to be back in part 2, talking all about McCartney replacement. Let's have a little break. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mark. Just to remind you, you can smoke out in the car park. There's a bar at the back behind the snooker room, and the ladies' toilets are to the right, and men's to the